management and to the discussion of tools and methods of operations management. Module 3, as I have mentioned before, was introducing some of these tools and techniques that we use in operations, although they're not specific to operations. So when you look at a number of the methods, I kept saying that a lot of these techniques are not explicitly or exclusively used for operations. They can be used for other circumstances as well, but we have operations problems that can be dealt with using these. The problem we'll deal with today is something that will help us probably understand something we discussed way at the beginning of this course, maybe in the second or third week. When we talked about process charts, if you remember, we talked about process charts and calculating process flow time or throughput time. One of the things we found in the data on the process chart was distance, the movement or the travel distance. And, that was used as one of the criteria of analyzing the process and maybe of determining, process performance characteristics. How do we get those distances? Where do those distances come from? I mean, the choice, is that a choice? Okay, or was that something that was simply forced upon operations managers, that you must have this particular distance to go from this point to this point? Now, obviously, you can already tell that the way the question is stated, that the answer would certainly be no. It's not something that is forced. It's something that is chosen. We choose a design, we choose a layout that will give us distances that are minimized. Why are we interested in minimizing distances? Because, as I have mentioned when we discussed that topic, movement, transportation is a non-value adding activity. So when we move from one point to another, it does not add any value to the product or service. And therefore, we want to minimize that travel, we want to minimize the distance that is covered. And in order to address that question, that's where today's topic comes into play. How do I design the layout of the facility so that the total distance traveled is minimized? Now, when we talk just about the distance that is traveled, okay, it may be a little bit misleading, because I might have a distance that is traveled that is quite long, but that is traveled very infrequently. So does that mean that these departments should be far from each other, should be close to each other? At the same time, I might have, two units or two departments that are, quite close, but there is no interaction between them. So is there a reason for having them next to each other? Obviously not. That is the question that we are trying to address today. How do I design the layout of a facility? How do I decide, for example, in a typical company, where I should put the storage, where I should put the production system, where I should put the accounting department, where I should put the marketing department and the administration of the management, and so on and so forth? And it's a very important question or decision, because, as we said, it already has some important impact on the process. The other thing is, while we are doing that, okay, we actually address various levels of detail, meaning I would start initially at the top level of the company. That means, for instance, I have the overall building or the facility for the company. Let's say I have only 4 departments: A, administration, B, C, and D. Okay. I have an initial decision to make, which is, how do I locate these departments relative to each other? Should A be next to B? Should it be next to D? Or should I have something else, such as, for instance, a situation where I have C closer to A instead of D. Okay, maybe another situation where I have, you know, D and B exchanging positions. What criteria will I need to make this choice? Well, as you can see, first of all, there is, you know, essentially two things I need to address. One is on determining how to locate, how to position each one of these departments. I need to know whether there is a need for that proximity. Should these departments be close to each other? And that information has to be used in the decision. What does that mean? Like, for instance, I would assume that in a, let's say in a hospital, an emergency room, okay, you would want to have the nurse's station where the triage is carried out next to the doctor consultation office, so that it's immediately from one step to the next it goes. Okay. In some cases, I might have a department that must be placed in one part of the building. Okay, like for instance, if this was the main road. Okay, if this is the main road, then I would want, for instance, the main entrance and the reception area and the you know, the welcome desk or the reception desk to be in the front of the building where, you know, the main entrance or the main road is. So there are criteria in deciding where to locate the various departments, or there are certain factors that are taken into account in deciding where to put this. In deciding where to put these relative to each other, the primary concern is there a need for them to be close to each other? And we can quantitatively measure that by using, or, you know, evaluate that by using some kind of a weight. For instance, I might say that, you know, A and B, these two departments, should be as close as possible to each other. And the other thing is obviously the actual distance that is traveled. Okay. Now, the actual distance that is traveled can be measured specifically in distance units like meters or feet or yards or whatever, or in cases where these blocks are of the same size, I can just look at it in terms of the number of trips. For example, if I go from A to B, it takes only one trip, one. Whereas if I go from A to C, I will need to go one, then two. So in this case, the distance is really two trips. From A to D, it's one. Obviously, if I have more than one alternative, then we go for the shortest, because I can go to D from A to B, B to C, C to D, that will be three. But actually A to D, we can only do that, or we can do that with only just one movement, with only one jump. So that's the first step, which is what information do I need in order to come up with these different plans? This is a plan, this is a different plan. And the next question becomes, how do I decide among these various alternative plans which is better? Now, we've already gave part of the answer, which is that we want to choose the plan that minimizes the total distance traveled, but also we want to make sure that that information about the need for departments to be close to each other is taken into account. And that is very important. So therefore, the distance must be also weighted by the so-called closeness factor, our assessment of the importance of two departments being close to each other. So that's the second step. All right. So first is the factors we use in deciding where to put each one of the departments. This is a plan. This is a proposed plan. Different plans will have different departments located in different parts of the facility. And then the question of choice. Which of these should I go for? Then in that case, we said we use some measure of distance and that closeness factor. Now, once I decide on a certain plan, between the two plans, for instance, these, I find that this is a better plan because the overall total distance is minimized. In that case, we need to go to the second step or the third step, which is to do the same thing, but internally to each department. What does that mean? Well, it means now if I have decided that, okay, as far as the various departments, I'm gonna allocate them or locate them in these places. Now I need to look at each one of the departments and actually do the layout of it. So I need to go look at unit A or department A, and within this department I'm going to do the same thing, which is decide within this department I have different workstations, I have different people, I have different machines. Where should these go? How should I put these various workstations or these various people or these various machines within that department? So we see we started from a layout of the facility as a whole, and then we break it down. Once I decide on the layout of the facility as a whole, I look at the layout of each of the different units internally. And then we can actually cascade through this. That means if this is a big unit, suppose that this is a fairly large, unit within this department, then we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to take that one unit, okay, and do a layout for that unit as well, okay, and do a layout for that. So it's a continuously refining the layout of the different, departments and units and even workstations within the organization. And the objective in all of them will be pretty much the same. In every one of these, at least at this introductory level, we are interested in minimizing the total distance that is traveled, because the distance traveled is a waste. Distance traveled, the movement, is non-value adding in the production process, and we want to minimize that as much as possible. This is a general view of what today's topic is about, okay? So, to summarize, the first thing is the importance of this. Why do we need this? Because, as we said, when we looked at the process analysis, one of the things we considered was the process flow time. The process flow time is certainly affected by the distances traveled. If I minimize that, I will certainly minimize the process flow time. So it's in our interest to design a layout for these various facilities and units and departments and workstations and so on and so forth, in order to achieve that objective, in order to have that efficient workspace. That's the objective of today's lecture. So formally, all right, I'm just going to take you through the main points in the lecture, and obviously consider the numerical example as usual. As I have been explaining, the layout is a decision on locating or positioning, deciding on the position of a department or an operation, because it could be a department, could be a unit within a department, could be a process or a sub-process within a unit, and so on and so forth, relative to each other. Okay, this is what layout is. This is by definition what layout is. In order to do this, we need to start by gathering the appropriate information. Appropriate information, as I said, is primarily the distance traveled, or the number of trips, or the number of movements, and the so-called closeness factor. How important is it for two units or two departments or two operations to be close to each other? You see, in some cases, they must be close to each other. For instance, if I take the example of a process, okay, that is fairly sequential, where I go from operation 1 to operation 2 to operation 3. You see, in this case, physically, this is how the product is done. I cannot go from 1 to 3 then to 2. It must be 1 to 2 to 3, for example, to 4. However, even in this case where I must have, for example, 1 next to 2, 2 next to 3, 3 next to 4, the series, the sequential design is not the only one, because I can have the same thing with a slightly different design. I could actually have the system designed in this manner. It's the same process where each of the steps are in this right order, but the design, the layout is different. I'm still going 1, 2, 3, 4. They are exactly next to each other, but it's a completely different design. This is a sequential design, all right? Whereas this is a U design, because it looks like a U. What are the advantages of this? One of the things that we can consider, for example, in this is the proximity of the various workstations to each other. The distance between every workstation to the other is probably minimized, because now, for instance, 1 and 4, if 1 and 4 used similar equipment, for instance, in the previous design, okay, they would have this kind of a distance to actually cover. Whereas now they are right next to each other. I could actually have a toolbox in the middle of the two stations and they can both use the same, instead of having to have two toolboxes of the same type for each workstation. So the design is not just dependent on the flow of the process. This is if I go to the lower level where I'm actually looking at the operation or the actual process. Okay, so this is just to comment on this idea about the information. So in the information, as we said, primarily we need the data, and we need an indication of the importance of departments or units or operations or tasks being close to each other. Based on that information, we develop a block plan. Now, how we develop a block plan? To keep things simple in this course, all right? We will develop a block plan simply by trial and error. That means we'll just, try and see if we can come up with a plan, and then, if we can come up with a different plan, and then maybe compare between them based on some criteria which we will define later on. Once I develop a block plan, then we go to the detailed plan, which is like the example I gave earlier. Okay, I start with a plan of the facility as a whole, where I'm going to put the various departments. Then I look at each department and define a layout for it, design a layout for it, where I'm going to put each unit in that department. And then I might look at each unit and determine where I'm going to put each desk, I'm going to put each machine, where I'm going to put each workstation, and so on and so forth. Even decisions on the aisles and the corridors and all that use of the space. These are the primary steps of designing a layout. Now, for the information, as I have mentioned, primarily there are 3 types of information that are needed when designing a layout. The first is the so-called closeness factor or weight. The closeness factor or closeness weight is an assessment of the importance of 2 components being close to each other. So therefore, if this weight is high, it means that it's important that these be closer to each other. If it's low, the lower it is, then the less important that they are close to each other. Okay, so for instance, if I take the example of a process here, 1 and 2 might actually have, if I'm using, let's say, a scale of 10, a closeness factor of the highest level of 10, because they must be next to each other. Okay, whereas 1 and 3 do not have to be next to each other. I might have, maybe other criteria. For instance, if 1 and 3 use one tool that is common to both of them, especially if this tool is like an expensive piece of equipment. Okay, I might actually also, have a weight between operation 1 and operation 3. The same thing can be done, obviously, with departments in general. The second piece of information is the distances that are traveled between departments. and between units or between workstations. I mean, as we go to lower and lower level of, or higher and higher level of detail, obviously, we're not only talking about departments. But in this, discussion, in this course, we'll keep things simple at the highest, level, which is primarily talking about departments. The other thing is having constraints, if there are any constraints on the location of departments. Like I gave already an example. For instance, the front desk, the waiting area, normally is at the main entrance of the building. So that as soon as customers walk in, they're already greeted with the welcome desk and the reception desk. It's just logical. Another example could be like when you look at, for instance, places such as Carrefour or Lulu. You will find that in their buildings, usually they have the receiving docks in one part of the building. The receiving docks is where the trucks bring the products to the company. They're usually, if this is the main entrance, then usually it's in the back of the building. Logically, that's a constraint. I need to have these trucks that are bringing the material in the back of the building. This is what a constraint means. It's a limit. That means we would like to make sure that the receiving docks are in the back of the building, whereas the main entrance is usually at the where the main road is. This is what constraints means. It means something that actually tells us that it must be in this location or the other. Another thing could be, sometimes could be a constraint. See, when you say it constraint means that it must be done. It's not like the closeness factor where we say, if we can do it, then we should do it. And for the constraints, it's a requirement. Constraint, it's a requirement. It's something that we must do. So for instance, in our example here, I will say that this part of the building is therefore reserved for the receiving department, and it's not actually part of what we choose in terms of the remainder of the design. So therefore, in this case, when I'm designing the layout for this facility, we'll ignore this because this already is taking, it's required to be in that part of the building, and then I will only focus on the rest of the building. All right, this is what the constraints refer to. Now, once we gather the information, then we develop block plans. In developing block plans, we are allocating the available space to operations or to departments and indicating their placement relative to each other. Meaning, in general, we will have a facility that is, let's say, divided into 6, parts, or 4 or 10 or whatever, how many departments, and I have as many departments or units that I need to decide where to put in this in this available space. These are the available spaces. These are the departments. My decision in coming up with a block plan is deciding where I'm going to put A, where I'm going to put B, where I'm going to put C, where I'm going to put D, where I'm going to put E, and where I'm going to put F. Every allocation gives me a different block plan. So this is one possible block plan. I could have another one that has A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on and so forth. Each one of these is a block plan. That's what a block plan is. It's an allocation of the space to the operations or to the departments. The follow-up question is that obviously you can see that there are many possible block plans. This is not the only one. I could have another one that has, as we saw earlier, I could have another one such as, A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, we have different block plans. How do I choose between these different block plans using the data that we have collected? Well, the answer is we need to look at the block plan that gives us the lowest total score, that is calculated as W times D, the weight multiplied by the distance. Okay, and obviously by doing that, we're making sure that the departments that have a high weight closeness factor are allocated or are placed next to each other. Okay. The way to do this is that for each block plan, we will determine the distance, okay, from each department to the other. We already have the weights, and then for every combination, I determine the corresponding W times D score. Distance in this case is measured in terms of the number of trips. So for instance, in this block plan here, okay, the distance from A to C is simply 1, because A, it takes only 1 trip to go to C, 1. Whereas from A to E, it takes 1, 2, 3. That will be 3. From A to F, 1, 2. From B to D, 1, 2, 3, and so on. Okay. The weights will be provided. In practice, though, how do these weights get generated? Well, typically it is based on the opinion of the people who are most familiar with the context of the problem. For instance, the management, when you're talking about the overall design of the facility. For instance, the people working in a specific department, when you're talking about the design of a specific department or unit. The analysis of the movements or the process can tell us, like for example, the example of the process we gave, we said that, in the sequential flow of work, those activities must be next to each other. I mean, there is no alternative to that. And the third step is, once we choose a block plan, then we look at detailed design, meaning I would consider the exact size and shape of each department and then arrange the elements within the department, like the units, the desk, the machines, and so on and so forth, even decisions on the aisles and the stairways and everything that has to do with the space usage in the department or in the unit. That is the important part. All right, so up to this point, are there any questions? Is this clear? Any questions up to this point? The overall logic and the procedure. We're going to go next to the application or the example. But, as you've already found out, the quantitative part, is not the most important, although it is important, but it's not the most important, because I've already mentioned this many, many times before. Computers and calculators can do calculations so much better than we can. It's the logic, it's the understanding of what things are. Okay. Well, Maimona says it's clear. Okay, so I guess it's clear then. All right. Let's move on then with the example that we have. A typical example would be like this, where I start with an existing plan. Okay. For instance, with this initial plan, I have decided to put the various departments 1 through 6 in these available slots. Okay. Now, just to understand or to see, how the distances are calculated, it's, as I said earlier, the number of trips. So from 3 to 6, it's 1. 3 to 4, it's 1, 2. 3 to 2, it's 1, 2, and so on. This is one possible plan. Okay. The closeness factors for this example are given as follows. Here, two things to observe. One is the scale. We are using here a scale from 0 to 10. Now, is this the only scale that we can use? Absolutely not. This is just a choice of a scale from 0 to 10. Where 0 is least important, 10 is most important. So what does that mean? It means that when I see 10 here, between Department 1, which is the administration, and Department 6, which is the internal audit, 10 means these two departments, it's very important that they are close to each other, that they are next to each other. Whereas when I see a 1, for instance, between social services and 4, which is accounting, it means that there is no, it's not that important. Okay, it's not that important. So the higher the number, the more important it is. And therefore we can see already the large numbers. 1 and 6, it's important that they are close to each other because they have a high closeness factor. 2 and 3, because there is a score of 8. And 3 and 5, there is a score of 9. And then you have others that have 3, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. But the important thing to notice here is that this is an increasing scale. So the higher value means that it's more important that they are close to each other. So now, given a block plan and given the closeness factors, we can certainly calculate the score, which is W times D. Suppose that we have developed another block plan, another proposed block plan, and in this block plan we have a requirement or a constraint, which is that departments 1 and 5 must be in these two locations. I already gave you an example in reality why that would be the case. For instance, 1 could be the main entrance and the reception area because it's where the customers come in. 5 could be maybe the receiving department. Okay, they must be in there, which means that I need to decide on the remaining 4 slots what to put in them in terms of the remaining departments 2, 3, 4, and 6. This block plan has already been developed and proposed. Now, how we actually develop this? Okay, well, it's a matter of a little bit of logic and common sense, and using essentially the closeness factors in making this decision. Once I have this, then I also now have therefore the distances for the second or for the proposed block plan, and based on that we develop this table, where in the table, as you can see, first of all, we have all the possible combinations, all the possible pairs. Now, where do I get this? The way to obtain these pairs is from the closeness factor table. Okay, because in this it will tell you which departments are paired and which are not. Like when you see here an empty space, means it's irrelevant. We are indifferent as to whether those two are close to each other or not, which means that we don't actually even need to consider that pair. So therefore, in this case, the pairs are 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6, 2, 3, 2, 4, 2, 5. There is no 2, 6, and you can see that in the table here. Okay, you see 2, 3, 2, 4, 2, 5, but there is no 2, 6 because it's irrelevant. 3, 4, and 3, 5. There is no 3, 6. 3, 4, 3, 5. There is no 3, 6 because it's irrelevant. And 4, 5 only. There is no 4, 6, and there is 5, 6. You see 4, 5 only. There is no combination of 4 and 6. Now for determining the closeness factors, that is already given. These closeness factors are from the table. So 1, 2, the closeness factor is 3, 1, 3, the closeness factor is 6, and you can already see that 3, 6, 5, and so on. Where do the distances come from? The distances are really the number of trips, if you will, between the various departments. So for instance, in the initial plan, the current plan, from 1 to 2, you can see 1 is right next to 2, so it's only one trip, and that's why we have 1 here. Whereas if I look at 1 to 4, okay, to go from 1 to 4, I will need to do 1, 2, 3, 3 movements. That's why we have 3 here. Take another example, 2 and 4. It says 2. To go from 2 to 4, it's 1, 2. That's why it's 2 movements. 3 to 5. From 3 to 5, it's 1, 2, 3 movements, and so on. Same thing for the second or for the proposed plan. Take, for instance, 1 and 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. If we take, for instance, 2 and 5, 1, 2, and that's why for 2 and 5 I have distance of 2 here. Then we calculate the WD score, which is simply a multiplication. We multiply the factor, the closeness factor, by the distance for each one of the plans. So in this case, this is 3 times 1, so 3. 6 times 1, 6, 5 times 3, 15, 6 times 2, 12, 10 times 2, 20, and so on. For the scores of the second or the proposed plan, all right? The factor multiplied by the distance, so 3 times 2, 6. 6 times 3, 18. 5 times 1, 5. 6 times 2, 12, and so on. That is the main, okay, idea. Okay, the distances are there. Now, how do I determine then which of the 2 plans is better? After I calculate the score for each pair, I sum all of the scores. So when you sum all of these scores, you'll find 112 here and 82 here. And as a result, we decide. The criteria, the rule is, as it says here, the lower, the better. Okay. So therefore, we choose the plan that gives us the lower total score. The plan that gives us the lower total score, which, as you can see here, is the proposed plan. It's 82 versus a score of 112 for the current plan. So therefore, what should we do? We should adopt the proposed plan. Is this the best plan? We don't know. Could there be another better plan? Maybe. The only way to do this, okay, the only way to do this is to solve this as an assignment problem. Now, many of you have probably taken operations research last semester. Okay, so you're certainly familiar with assignment problems. And in our case, it is definitely an assignment problem. I have 6 spaces and I have 6 departments in this example. And I need to decide where to put each one of these, given the fact that we want to minimize the total distance that is traveled, okay, which is W times D. And we can actually do that formally. Now, obviously, we're not asking you to do that in this course. In this course, we're just going to take 2 plans, compare them, choose the better one based on the one that has the lower total score. That's basically it. Okay. So if we, you know, to conclude this, all right, in any layout problem, we are interested in determining where the various departments or operations should be positioned relative to each other. And you can see that in order to do this, we gather information in terms of the distances and in terms of the closeness factors, calculate a so-called WD score, and choose the plan that has the least score. That's the overall idea. All right, any questions on this? No? Okay. Before we look at the practice exercise, okay, here's one thing that we want to do. How about, first of all, doing this in Excel? Okay. How we can do this in Excel? All right, now, distances. So the distances are given, the closest factors are given. To calculate the scores, as you can see, you can just take the closeness factor multiplied by the distance, and you can just, you know, copy this down. For the total, okay, it is the sum of all of these values. And there is no surprise, it should be 112. Again, the same thing here. Closeness factor multiplied by the distance. And copy it throughout. The total is the sum of all of these. Okay. And there we have a total of 82, obviously. Okay, there's no surprise in there. Okay, now just to conclude, and let's see if you all understand what's going on here. Suppose that I come up with another plan. Okay. So 1 and 5 cannot be changed. Okay. So suppose that these are the ones that cannot be changed. Okay. If I look at the closeness factors and try to decide, now you can see that, you see, 1 has to be very close to 6, must be next to 6. So where could I put 6? That means I could put 6 here or here. Okay. So the one that they have used here, okay, suppose they have used there, let's use the other one. Suppose I put 6 here. Why? Because I said, according to the closeness factor, 1 and 6 must be close to each other. 2 and 4, actually the next one is 3 and 5. 3 and 5 should be close to each other. So it's better to put 3 here, because that's the closest to 5. Then 2 and 3 have to be close to each other. So therefore I'll put 2 here, which means that I have 4 here. This is, by the way, one way of generating the block plan. All right. This is one way of generating the block plan. So what I do is I just look at the closeness factors and use what we call a greedy approach. That means I'm actually going to use the put the ones with the highest closeness factors next to each other and keep doing that as long as it is doable. So now I have, okay, a third plan, and we're going to do that somewhere here. So I'm going to add here another plan. We're going to have the for K3 and the distance. So let's get the distance from this plan. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do the, okay. Let's see if you're following and if you understand what's going on. So what's the distance between 1 and 2 in my new plan? Hello? I have now a new plan, a new block plan, okay? And I need to determine the distances. So what is the distance in the pair 1, 2? What is the distance? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so can anyone tell me what is the distance between 1 and 2? Because you've all said everything is clear, and I was talking for about an hour. So now what's the difference between 1 and 2 in my new plan here? This is 1, this is 2. So how many trips? 1, 2. The distance is therefore 2. How about 1, 3? From department 1 to 3. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 movements. That's how we calculate the distance. This example is to show you how we get the distance. 1 to 4, there's only 1. Okay. 1 to 5. 1, and this is 5. So 1, 2. 1 to 6, next to each other. So 1. 2 to 3, next to each other. So 1 movement. 2 to 4, next to each other. This is 2, this is 4. So they're next to each other, which means 1. 2 to 5, this is 2, this is 5. So we're going to do 1, 2. Distance is therefore 2. 3 to 4, this is 3, this is 4. So 1, 2. 2 movements. And the distance is therefore 2. 3 to 5, they're next to each other. So it's 1. 4 to 5, this is 4, this is 5. How many movements? 1, 2, 3. Therefore distance of 3. Finally, 5 to 6. Can anyone tell me this last one? What's the distance? 1. Very good.
1.
Correct. It's 1. The score, therefore, the WD, okay, is W times D. Now, do you think that this plan will be better than the K2 or will be worse? Logically, I mean, we did it like using some greedy approach, you know. Do you think it will be better or worse? That means, do you think it's going to have a total more than 82 or less than 82?
I think less than 82.
Probably. Well, let's find out.
More.
Turned out to be slightly more. Actually, K2 is still a better plan. And this is, by the way, a good point to make, which is that when we use the greedy approach, greedy means I actually placed the departments based on the highest score and kept going down. So I put 1 next to 6 because I have a 10. Then I put 3 next to 5 because I have a 9. Then I put 2 next to 3 because I have an 8. Okay? That this approach, the so-called greedy approach, is not always necessarily the best approach. And this is a case in point. It actually doesn't give us the best block plan. Block plan 2 is actually better than the one we have generated using this greedy type approach. Okay. Now, as I said, now the only way to find out, so which is the best approach of all or the best plan of all, the only way to do that is to actually solve the assignment problem as you have done in operations research, if you've done that before. That's the only way to actually go about it. And you can find out at that point, you know, what is the best allocation of these departments to the available space and find the optimal assignment. Other than that, we do what we are doing here, which is that I develop different block plans using primarily trial and error, because that's what we did here. You know, we said, you know, using trial and error in most cases, we there it is. Okay, using trial and error, we develop different block plans, compare them based on the total WD score, and then choose the one that has the lowest total score. In practice, by the way, the problem is not this simple, because I keep repeating that these techniques, they help us to make a decision, they don't make the decision on our behalf. So actually, in practice, that this score could be just one of the factors among many others in making the decision on how to lay out the facility. Okay, because there could be some other factors that are you know, of more of a subjective nature. You could have, like, for instance, individual choices of different departments and especially, you know, powerful individuals within the organization, okay, in selecting certain parts of the facility, maybe because of the view that they might have, maybe because of the accessibility to some amenities in the facility, like the canteen or whatever. So there are other factors. This could be just one important factor that is used in the overall decision to make. The decision to lay out a facility is typically not an operational, not a day-to-day decision. It's typically a medium or long-term decision. That means we do not make this decision very frequently. Because, as you can see, you know, generally speaking, the factors that go into making this choice do not change overnight. So therefore, usually when we make a decision on the layout, we'll probably stay like that for quite some time. And that, my friends, is the story I have for you today. So I hope that you enjoyed the story behind your screens, you know, I mean, just looking at your names. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? Are there any comments? Are there any thoughts? Any things you want to add to? Is this clear?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Tarif. Okay, all right. Then I think this is a good point to stop. We'll leave it there, and when we come back at 1 o'clock, we'll look at the practice exercise. Okay. And if you have obviously any questions or any comments, think about them and raise them when we come back. See you then.